And your moderator for this session is a dear friend who's worked for years in the international media before setting up his own independent media company, Ilves International, which he runs as the CEO. So please, a very warm welcome for Andres Ilves.
Good afternoon. I hope you're enjoying the conference. As Riz just mentioned, it's nearing its close, and this should be a nice, vibrant debate, we hope, on a topic that touches on individual lives and is something that is dear to the hearts of many people. It's because in so many places in the world, use of cannabis, possession, and other ways of engaging with cannabis are not legal. It's hard to get statistics, but some of the statistics that are out there are that last year, every seventh person in the US partook of cannabis. That also in the US, more than half of the residents of the US have used cannabis at some point in their life. So this is not an idle topic, and of course it's not just a US issue, but those are some of the statistics that were most easily available for us to kick off the discussion. So it's something that can bring in a lot of money. The enforcement of anti-cannabis laws costs a lot of money. It's a money issue, it's a health issue, it's a, well, there's a broad slate of issues, and it's something that we have an esteemed panel of experts to talk about, who I'd like to invite and get this conversation going. And so we've all agreed to be informal and use our first names in this discussion, even though these are all very experienced people and so on. But the first person I'd like to invite up is Dr. Jerrol Thompson, who is a medical doctor, a former parliamentarian, and now he's the head of the Medical Cannabis Authority of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Welcome. The next person I'd like to call up is Mr. Borut Strükelj, professor at the Department of Pharmaceutical Biology at the University of Ljubljana, based in Slovenia and the US. The next person I'd like to invite up is Angus Taylor, founder of New Leaf Cannabis Retail Network in Canada. Will Jones III, Communications and Outreach Associate at Smart Approaches to Marijuana, SAP, USA. And finally, Zhibek Zholdassova, who is a psychiatrist, who will be providing another point of view on this particular issue. So I'm just going to ask each of you to start off with a quick comment. Just what's the first thing that comes to mind that you want to get across in our conversation today, and then we'll go back and forth, and it's all going to be very informal and a discussion. So would you like to start, Jerrol?
Yes, well, it's a pleasure being here today. I think the quick message that I want to put over is we have moved on from our old thinking of cannabis, and the medical benefits are real. It is a matter now of how do we trade, how do we use it, and how do we make this available to patients in a safe and effective manner. That's what I want to say.
Thank you. Borut, your thoughts?
Thank you, Anders, for giving me the word. Yes, this is a very important starting point. I would like to focus on two different items. Actually, it's in parallel. It is legalization and regulation. We have to regulate first the use of the cannabis in this or that matter, and then it is about legalization. This is the question about the parliament of each country, of each state, and of course it's important, but we have in our hands a very powerful remedy, powerful remedy which could be, let's say, divided into two subclasses or into two varieties. We're talking about industrial hemp, which is industrial cannabis, and real in parentheses, which means Indian one with a lot of THC. So we are talking today about two different cannabinoids, CBD and THC. that means there are two very effective remedies, and I'm pharmacist. I'm pharmacist and I'm MD as well. So I would like to address this to you, that these two components derive from two different varieties, but both are very useful in hands of the physician, in hands of the pharmacist. And let me address the question for all of you here. What is more important from the health point of view, safety or efficacy? This I'm going to answer you later on, but think about this, safety or efficacy. Thanks.
And just before I go to Zhibek, I want to emphasize this is a global question. This is something that we're looking at. There are many countries, obviously 200 plus countries in the world, each with different laws. There are regional laws in different places, but we're looking at this in the broader sense because different countries have different experience, but we're looking at the big issue of cannabis in the world today. Zhibek.
Today's topic is a complicated one, and it's a coin with two sides. There are positive side and there are very negative ones as well. We all need to understand what's good and what kind of harm we're dealing with. From a medical perspective, every medication is clearly regulated and dosed to get the medical effect. And cannabis, if we legalize it medically, it also needs to be dosed, keeping in mind what's the dosage that is helpful for an individual, for a patient, depending on the symptoms.
Sorry, Anders, may I interrupt you? It's very important to know. You know, Paracelsus in the 15th century, he said, you all know Paracelsus was one of the first doctors. He said, sola dosis facit venenum, which means only from the dose depends if the compound will be toxic or will be a healthy one. And this is the answer to the talk before.
Thank you. Angus.
Good afternoon. I guess I'd like to start by thanking the forum for including this discussion in this year's discussions. I come from Canada, obviously the first G7 country to fully legalize cannabis consumption on a recreational level. But that was a long process to get to where we got to last October. Starting 10 years ago with a Supreme Court challenge that granted medical access to patients so that they could treat themselves with cannabis. And over a course of many years, policies and that were required to grow the plant legally were developed, capacity in the country to develop facilities to grow the plant carefully and under controlled circumstance in a regulated way. And finally, the way that retail locations were allowed to enter the ecosystem for recreational sales. I guess I'm the entrepreneur on the panel. I developed the largest Canadian retail chain, which I sold last fall. But my current company is actually a pharmaceutical focused company that extracts active ingredients from the cannabis plant and delivers them to pharmaceutical companies for the formulation of various types of medications. I'm very interested in what the cannabis plant can deliver, and in fact it is actually a Kazakh story. Ethnobotanists have traced the origins of cannabis to Central Asia over 12,000 years ago. The plant originated here and was first cultivated. Since then, the plant has traveled as people have colonized the earth, and seeds have been carried as people have moved around, and the plant now exists in a natural way in virtually every country around the world. And it's only in the last 100 years that the plant became vilified, and the laws changed to consider it something that was bad for you. So in Canada, I think many are quite happy that the change in policy has occurred, and we see countries around the world engaging in one of the most significant revisions to drug policy that's occurred in the last 50 years.
Thank you, Angus. So we're bringing it home by having this subject here today in Kazakhstan.
Indeed.
Will.
It's an honor and privilege for me to be here with you all. I work for the organization Smart Approaches to Marijuana, and we are a bipartisan marijuana policy organization in the United States. We were founded by Democratic Congressman Patrick Kennedy, a former drug policy advisor to the Bush, Clinton, and Obama administrations, Dr. Kevin Zhibek, and David Frum, a Republican pundit. And so we're a bipartisan organization working on marijuana policy that's between two extremes. Too often the discussion on marijuana policy has been held on the extreme of either incarceration and criminal penalties, or on the other spectrum, commercialization, where in the United States we are having companies like Philip Morris and big tobacco companies investing in the marijuana product as a new product line. And our organization really believes that the road forward in marijuana policy is one where we're navigating those two extremes, where no one's incarcerated or gets a criminal record for using marijuana. But on the other hand, we don't allow a predatory industry that will make billions of dollars by addicting people to their product to flourish in our country. I tell people one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this topic and how I first got involved with this is where I live in Washington, D.C., in my community. When I walk out the front door of my house, the first store that I get to in any direction is a liquor store. If I go a little bit farther, I'll get to a convenience store, but it'll be so plastered with advertisements for tobacco, alcohol, and the lottery that I can't see inside the windows of that store. And in the United States, particularly in communities of color, there's a disproportionate targeting of our communities by big tobacco, by alcohol, and other predatory addictive industries that have a negative health implication in our communities. And we really don't want to repeat the mistakes that we've had in the past with tobacco and see that reinvented today in 2019 with marijuana, with essentially an alternative product line for some of the biggest tobacco companies that have now in the past couple of years invested billions of dollars in the marijuana industry. And I tell people in Colorado, there are more pot shops than Starbucks and McDonald's combined. I don't know how many Starbucks and McDonald's there are here in Kazakhstan, but in the United States, it's one of the franchise you see it everywhere. But in Colorado, there are now more, again, marijuana stores than Starbucks and McDonald's combined, and they're disproportionately placed in minority communities, communities of color like mine. And so we again see that as another extreme when we're talking about marijuana policy.
Thank you, Will. So everybody has a different approach. It's not as though you're disagreeing, but you are focusing on different aspects of it. And one thing that occurs to me is that there are different uses for marijuana. There's medical, medicinal, however you want to term it, and then there's other, recreational, however you will. Shall we start with the medical issue? Because that seems like an easier one to tackle, because it's a medical issue and that can be discussed in different terms. Obviously, there are different viewpoints. And then we can ease into recreational. Is that a fair way to start it? Medical, I'd like to start with you, Jerrol.
I think that's important to start with. And I want everyone to understand the whole premise of this discussion we're having today. And I brought a slide along with me to help me talk about this. Only if the organizer could throw up the slide. Is it that I have to put it on? Yeah. Now,
if it doesn't, you go.
Yes. I want everyone to look at this slide. I'm going to go through it very quickly. The first column on your left. Inside everybody's body, there is a system. Now, I want to tell you that prior to the 1990s, everyone thought that cannabis was bad. It was terrible. Terrible for your health. And Angus would have spoken about, well, maybe 100 years ago and before that, we thought it was good. But up until the 1990s, research that was being done was to show that cannabis was bad. Cannabis destroys the brain. And then in 1992, 93, 94, 95, we discovered something we did not know before. Now, every one of you have a respiratory system, allows you to breathe. Every one of you have a circulatory system, your heart and your veins and your blood could circulate. Well, in addition, you have what's called an endocannabinoid system. There are receptors in your brain. And there are other receptors in your skin and your liver and your intestines. And guess what? Your body produces some very special substances. They're up there. Anandamide and 2-AG in red. Your body, everybody's body produce those substances. And they control some important body functions. When you look over to the right, to the left, they control your mood. They control your sleep. They control your pain level. They control your appetite. Have you ever thought what controls your appetite? Is it just seeing food? Or what controls your sleep? Well, there are multiple factors, but this system that we only discovered in the 90s, 1995, that system helps to control some of these functions. And guess what? You could have a deficiency in this system in the same way like diabetes, where you can have a deficiency in insulin. You could have a deficiency in the system. And what we found is that cannabis can be used almost as a substitute for some of these substances produced in our bodies. And so when you take cannabis, some of the substances in the cannabis we call cannabinoids can have particular effects. And some of these cannabinoids can have greater effects on pain. Others can have greater effect on sleep. My colleague here would have mentioned two of them, THC and CBD. But truthfully, there are many others. And I think that in the future, we are going to see some emphasis on some of these other cannabinoids, CBC, CBG. Now, I may be talking something very technical here, but I wanted to put this slide up to tell you that there is a system in your body that many of you did not know about. And this system controls some important body functions that are very important for the medicinal use of cannabis. And I think that would be the basis by which we take off today. Other colleagues here and panelists may have different opinions, but I think that's the basis by which we should start on. That you know there is a system in every single one of your bodies that controls these things, your mood, your sleep, your appetite, pain levels, and so forth.
Thank you. I think we can take the slide down so we don't get distracted from our speakers. But thank you for pointing that out. I think if you could just quickly follow up a couple of sentences on, you've explained the science. What does it really mean? So basically, since the 90s, they have been prescribing cannabis.
I think what I want to say is that many of the programs that said that cannabis had no use whatsoever, it was dangerous, they were wrong.
And what's right?
They were wrong.
So how can it be used quickly?
Really, in terms of, and I think we need to get this out, we're not talking about massive doses. Sometimes it's just a matter of microdosing. But we could extract the various cannabinoids from the cannabis. They're in the form of oils. And we can apply them in different means. It doesn't have to be smoking it. It could be under your tongue. It could be a cream. It could be a patch. It could even be in edibles, such as a cake. But there are many ways of taking it. But it's all about dosing. And they can be used to alleviate certain type of effects, in particular pain. And we're now finding some of these cannabinoids are important for cancer condition. They have some benefits in reducing cell multiplication. And the research is ongoing. But what we know already, we know enough that medicinal cannabis has a profound place in the way in which we treat persons. And now, over 40 countries of the world have legalized medicinal cannabis. My country, St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the Caribbean, has done so. And patients are now able to benefit from this cheaper form of medications and
Thank
their
you.
benefit.
Which is actually, it's great to have the science underpinning. We keep on hearing about medical cannabis, but what does that really mean? So would someone quickly like to tell us what it actually means in practice so that we all know? You walk into what? I mean, it's different countries. Anyone want to give?
I'll jump in here. I think it's important to distinguish what the medicinal use of the plant is versus recreational use. And unfortunately, too often, there are three separate issues when it comes to marijuana policy that often get conflated. There's decriminalization, which is removing criminal penalties for marijuana use, removing arrest records and those things for people that have used it, and I hope everyone in this room agrees with that. There's the medicinal use, which was just explained, and then there's recreational use, which is essentially use for fun. I think there's probably common agreement with everyone here that there's a genuine medicinal use of the plant. However, I would submit to you that the term medical marijuana is an inappropriate name, or medical cannabis, it's an inappropriate name for that. And here's what I mean by that. We have, for example, morphine, which is a derivative of opium, or aspirin, which, it comes from willow tree bark, essentially. And these things, we don't say we have medical opium laws or medical willow tree bark laws because there's a genuine medicinal process by which the beneficial components are harnessed out of the raw plant. It is made medically available via prescription, as the doctor was talking about, and it's not smoked. And so everyone, I think, would agree that there should be a way to harness the medicinal components of the marijuana plant. It's like thousands of other plants that we should harness and use, but that's a different discussion than saying legalize marijuana, because again, no one's talking about we should legalize opium, even though we have morphine, which comes from that. And so it's important to distinguish when we talk about illegal or legal marijuana policy, and then we bring in the medicinal use of it. It really should be in its own category when we're talking about the medicinal use of the plant versus legalization, because legalization is about recreational use, and recreational use lends itself to abuse, just like the alcohol and tobacco industries, where they get over 70% of their revenue from the heavy users and those with substance abuse problems. So if you responsibly use alcohol or tobacco, you make no difference to the bottom line of the commercial industries. Budweiser, which has $6 million for a 30-second Super Bowl ad, that is because they're making the majority of their money off of people, 70% again, from people that drink over 10 drinks a day on average. And so that's something completely different than the medicinal use of the plant. And I think it's very important that we distinguish legalization from the medicinal use of the plant and recreational use, which industries like big tobacco and big alcohol want to use addiction for profit.
Thank you, Will, for clarifying those three categories, and we can use that here. Borut.
Thank you. This is a very important point. I'm really glad to start with this. We have to distinguish between recreational and medicinal. Allow me to say a few words about medicinal use and the safety. I mean, both hemp and cannabis are excellent raw materials for extracting remedies, for extracting active pharmaceutical ingredients. But let me ask you the following, the audience. If you get ill because of the bacterial infection, what is the first step? You go to the doctor in order to get the prescription for antibiotics, right? So, alternative way, why do not you moisture or put some drop of waters on the surface of a white bread and leave the bread for 24 hours somewhere in a humid environment? What will be the consequence of this? The bread will be full of molds and fungi, like penicillium fungi, asparagus, asparagus fungi, and so on. I mean, there are different species. So, why do not you use this kind of bread in order to cure your disease? Because you trust doctors, you trust pharmacists, and finally, dose. Again, we are talking about dose. You know exactly the dose of the penicillin, which is actually in these molds. Or another very, very informative case. Do you know the plant's Atropa belladonna, deadly nightshade? You could grow it in your garden, but I never see this plant in your garden. It's excellent remedy, excellent medicinal plant, which it is spasmolytic, which means that relieve your spasms. Why we do not use leaves instead of pills? Because the overdose might be dangerous. The overdose might be deadly for our organism. Let me go back to the cannabis. Allow to regulate the cannabis, the marijuana, as a starting raw material for producing the regulated medicines. And this is the point. Regarding the recreational use, okay, This is the question of each parliament, of each country. We are talking about jobs. We're talking about VAT, I mean taxation. It's all fine. But at the end of the day, we are faced with the same, let's say, system like it is using of cigarettes, I mean smoking, alcohol, and so on and so on, is the question of the parliaments. So let me go back. One very important thing you should remember, this is take-home message for all of you. How many liters of waters in the period of half an hour you could drink and not being intoxication by water? You know that water is the basic molecule. The answer is, depends on your body mass index, but the answer is 10 liters or let's say 15 liters. If you drink 15 liters of waters within the period of half an hour, you will die because you will dilute the potassium in your blood so much that the heart is going to stop.
Borut, a quick question. So obviously, we're focused on the medical use, but I'm hearing different ways of using it for medical use. There are products, byproducts, if you will, and then there's, frankly, the popular image of what medical use of marijuana means is that, I mean, I'm not an expert, but basically somebody might be terminally ill, or again, this is sort of the common, word in the street, is that there are people who have wasting syndrome or had it when in a different era of AIDS. For whatever reason, they need to gain weight, and cannabis causes whatever increased appetite, that you would go to a place and then use it however it's used. That's different from a byproduct and licensing byproducts. So is that wrong, that very sort of common image of medical use of marijuana taking place in a particular center, whether it's a store or a medical facility or someplace in your community where people who are, for example, terminally ill would go and use cannabis for medical purposes themselves?
Okay, at the moment, there are 3 indications. Cancer, then epilepsy, and multiple sclerosis. In all 3 cases, cannabis, it is the remedy. However, we should not be, let's say, convinced that the cannabis could cure cancer. No, but there are 3 very important points to consider. First one, it is appetite, increase of the appetite. Second is sleepiness, which is very important. And the third, reduce of the pain. So, but when we are talking about multiple sclerosis, yes, we are surprised on the effects of the marijuana combination of THC, CBD1 to 1, and there is a drug already. I'm not going to go into details because this is advertisement, and I would not like to advertise the pharmaceutical company, but there is a drug which is available on the market, which actually decrease the disease which is called multiple sclerosis. So yes, I mean, there are a lot of indications, and but we should go with the studies, with the availability under the prescription. This is important to say.
Thank you. Zhibek, I'm interested in your point of view on this.
Well, medicine is limitless and endless. You see, for any disease, there are several levels of the influence of medications. One of them is symptomatic. That's the effect that cannabis has. It can eliminate certain symptoms of this or that disease. There are some other levels, for instance, pathogenetical, pathophysiological. That's when a medication acts on the mechanism of disease development, and there is ethiopical treatment when you eliminate the cause, and the person can be cured. For instance, if it's an inflammation of lungs, then you prescribe antibiotics, you eliminate the cause, and the person can be cured. If it's a pathological, let's say hypertension treatment, most of the medications are pathogenetical. They are built into the system, and they change the mechanism of disease development. And the level of cannabis effect is symptomatic. You can only take out the symptoms. different types of articles that pop up here and there talking about cannabis affecting other mechanisms of treatment are not fully supported by a well-established proof, and therefore we're talking about symptomatic treatment for now. If the dose is exceeded, we have 3 stages of intoxication by cannabis or marijuana. The first one is euphoric stage. So if, as the patients say, that's one long smoke of cigarette with marijuana. But who will stop after one very first inhaling? No, everyone continues after that. And the second one is the sedative stage. And at those 2 stages, we see the medical effect. The third one is overdose. The third stage is hallucination. Therefore, the risks of complications at that stage are rather substantial. For instance, when it comes to mental diseases, if a person has a certain things that might lead him to schizophrenia, then psychosis symptoms will be manifested much faster with the use of cannabis. Therefore, the dose is very important when it comes to the way we apply it, and given in the fact that sometimes we use it for entertainment, for fun. Certainly, adolescents are prone to getting addicted up to 21 years of age. Young people try to start trying all types of psychotropic substances, smoking, alcohol, different types of narcotics, including cannabis. Kazakhstan has 80% of addicts of cannabis among all of the generalized number of addicts at this time. So if someone did not abuse until the age of 21 those psychotropic substances, the risks of that person becoming addicted goes down in many ways, and therefore we need to make sure that adolescents do not have access to those substances, just like it is with alcohol. Until 21, we don't use alcohol, and we try to fend people off.
I want to move the discussion along. Let's see if I can try to draw a line under this. Okay, 1 second. We'll see whether we disagree or not on the following proposition. Based on what you all have said, if it is medically shown to be of use and it is regulated, would you all agree that there are some circumstances where purely for medical purposes alone, again, if regulated by a doctor, if prescribed, including the dosage, and in a controlled environment, that use of cannabis is actually okay under those circumstances, regulated for medical conditions that have been diagnosed by a doctor, dosed by a doctor, and so on? Would you all agree with that? Will? Angus? Zhibek? If regulated and controlled? Oh, go ahead. You don't agree.
I think part of the struggle is that so often when we're talking about medical marijuana, it's often an abuse of the term medical. So in the United States, I don't know how it is in other countries, but there was a survey that was done that found that the average person that had a medical marijuana card was a 35-year-old white male that said he had back pain, and so he got a medical marijuana card. The percentage of people that use it for life-threatening diseases or things like that was under 5% in that survey that was done. And so the reticence of that we see around people, I think, sometimes getting behind medical is because, again, saying medical marijuana is really an inappropriate term for what it is. There are actually some medications in the U.S. that the FDA recently approved. Epidiolex is a derivative of it. And so that's an example. Once it's actually gone through the scientific process and it's available, that's called Epidiolex. That's not called medical marijuana. And most people would not have a problem with that because there is a dosage for that. You can get a prescription, etc. But when we have the broad term medical marijuana, that is very often abused and misused and used as a cover for people to just smoke or say, I have some problems, so I need some medical marijuana.
So perhaps for a terminal condition, or as Zhibek mentioned, sclerosis, epilepsy, cancer, if properly diagnosed, if not abused, then you'd agree with that premise?
Yep, 100%.
What I would like to add, that really what we're talking about is a regulatory issue here. And the fact is that in the states that first approached legalization in the US, there was no roadmap for how to develop a system and how to appropriately separate recreational from medicinal. And as a result, the system gets gamed by those that are looking for recreational marijuana and make excuses with maybe made-up medical conditions that give them that access. But in the process of developing Canada's regulations, I would take offense to the idea that recreational marijuana is going to be dominated by bad actors. My own company, for instance, when we took the approach of appropriate and responsible adult use, looked very carefully at how we would counsel customers in our stores to be directed towards products that were appropriate to them, how to consume those safely and responsibly, how to store that safely at home so that that children that may find those products don't, or that they're locked away appropriately. And the way that Canada has regulated recreational stores is quite carefully. We're not permitted to advertise. Those that walk by the stores can't actually even see through the windows. So there's no way for children to actually see the product. And there's been a very careful approach to ensuring that those that want to consume cannabis have access to it, but at the same time, those that would be at greater risk are protected at the same time.
So, quick question to perhaps two of the skeptics on this issue on the panel: is there a place in the world?
Sorry, let me go.
Is there a place in the world where this is working? Again, we're still doing medical, where there is a properly regulated, nearly impossible to abuse system that you think is a model that the rest of the world could use? Is there one? Will?
I mean, I think even with our regular medicines, we know that they can be abused, whether it's opioids, what have you. So we know that every system is going to have its vulnerabilities. It can be abused by those that want to abuse it. And I think really, again, it's digging into the principles of which one has a legitimate place in our society and which one doesn't. I think, again, everyone would agree the medicinal use has a legitimate place in our society. I would probably, I definitely, our organization does not agree that a recreational industry has a place in our society. Any system, though, can and will be abused by people that want to work around the rules. It's interesting, though, the data that we have from the recreational system in the United States and the states that have tried it is extremely concerning, where we're seeing things like increased accidents from drug driving. We're seeing increased cases of kids going to the emergency room because they've got, people are not storing it properly, not using it properly. We're seeing massive commercialization. Why perhaps it's different in Canada. In the United States, there's billboards, there's magazine advertisements, online advertisements for marijuana. And probably, again, most concerning, while it's nice that Canada would want to keep out kind of the big tobacco players, at least in the United States, we've seen that Altria, which is kind of the mother company of Marlboro, they've invested billions of dollars in the industry in the past couple of years, and it's not just Altria and Marlboro, it's been other alcohol companies like Heineken, Blue Moon, Molson Coors. So we're seeing the big alcohol players and the big tobacco players that are investing in the industry. And what's extremely concerning, I don't think anybody on this panel wants young people to use, but when we allow commercial industries like Philip Morris and Marlboro to have the product, or Juul, we can see that in 2019, Juul has created in the United States, Juul is a vaping product, they've created an epidemic of smoking among young people, and they're under investigation by our FDA for the things that they've done. And we're seeing that Altria, and again, these big tobacco companies have invested in the vaping industry. The vaping industry has also invested in the marijuana industry. And if we see that, again, in 2 weeks ago, Philip Morris was just had to suspend a campaign because they were using social media influencers to market their products to younger people that shouldn't be using. And so this is a problem when we're talking about a commercial industry. They have hundreds of billions of dollars that they want to make, and the only way to get that lifelong user or to get the most lifelong users, to get them when they're at a young age. As was already mentioned, if you start after the age of 21 or 25, you're very unlikely to abuse the product. And from a bottom line perspective for these companies, you're a very low concern to them. You don't give them hardly any profit if you use it responsibly from the big picture. And last piece of data out of Colorado, they did a survey to see where their sales were going. And again, it was just like the alcohol industry. I think it was 68% of the sales were to 20% of the users. And again, those are users that have substance abuse problems, that have issues of addiction, and those that are prone to abuse it. So they would have a negative societal impact, such as, again, drug driving. And I will say this also, I forgot this. In Colorado, 70% of marijuana stores recommended their product to pregnant mothers. They recommended their products to pregnant mothers. And so this is what an industry that wants billions of dollars is going to do.
We'll stop it.
Thank
Stop
you.
it.
Jerrol?
Anders, I disagree with this.
I know. I think let's put this in perspective. In 1961, there was an international treaty that banned cannabis internationally. And there have been other treaties since. In that treaty, it says under Article 4 that any country, and Article 23, any country that wants to get into the trade or the use of cannabis must pass laws to regulate it. They must license the entities, and the only thing they could do it for is for medicinal purposes and research. They cannot do it for recreational purposes, period. Now, we know for a fact some countries and individuals have been doing it on an illegal basis for a long time. And unfortunately, or fortunately, some countries have decided they are going to buck the United Nations system and say they are going to still legalize recreation. I have no problem with Canada doing it. In the United States, certain states have gone ahead and legalized it recreationally.
We're going to get to that.
I know we're going to get to that.
Okay.
But you see, going back to the issue, the only thing that is legal is medicinal and research.
Yes.
But
Exactly.
we know that the illegal recreational trade has been around and has been the booming trade in which crooks and other things have been engaged in for a long time. Now, there's some benefit in trying to rein that in, bringing people in from the cold and trying to control it. But I want to just focus on the other thing. I know
Don't focus, because we have to wrap this part up. We're
right.
really running out of time.
All right.
But thank you for that. I think we got the point, and I'm enjoying the
Yes.
range of opinions.
Yes.
One sentence, Borut, something you want
Oh,
to add?
thank you very much. Yes, I
one.
disagree partially with the Will. He's talking about legalization. Yes, this is completely different story. Coming back to the medical use, perhaps you are aware about the marijuana was introduced into U.S. pharmacopoeia. Till 1941, this was a classical remedy, and then was banned because of this you already talked about. So, a very nice example about the safety. Now, this is my answer about the safety. May I?
Yep. One sentence.
Okay, just this. Bayer Pharmaceutical company produced aspirin and heroin in the last century, and they banned heroin because of low safety and high efficacy, and aspirin is still among us. So safety is very important. Thank you.
Now, should people be sitting behind bars for a short time or for many, many years in any way connected with marijuana? Is there any use of marijuana? Obviously, it is the case in lots of places where it's illegal. Do you think those laws should be changed? Should people be sitting in any form of incarceration because of use of marijuana?
So, despite legalization in Canada, there are still laws on the books that can result in jail time. Selling to those that are under 18, for instance, is still in the criminal code. And and there are still penalties that are attached with selling to inappropriate customers.
So selling to inappropriate customers, so basically sales, not possession or use, and to minors, for example.
Yeah, even minors are not allowed to possess more than a certain amount at any time, and if they sell to each other or they even give it to each other, if parents give product to their children, those are all still criminal offenses in Canada at this time as well. We don't expect that to ever change either, and I'm sure that otherwise records are being expunged. So there has been an enormous number of people who've suffered incarceration because of cannabis possession or use or drug dealing, and many jurisdictions, including California, are looking at expunging criminal records altogether. In Canada, they're talking about not quite as far as expungement, but taking these offenses off of people's records.
Great, thank you. Zhibek, what do you think? Should people be going to prison for using marijuana?
For consumption, hard to say. No, probably not. Because it's either a person who is ill because it's addiction and it makes no sense to incarcerate him for that. Most likely, we should just recommend that person get him into rehab for addiction treatment. And so what we got? If we were to legalize fully consumption of cannabis, what we'll get? We'll get another psychoactive substance in circulation, something like alcohol, that people are free to use or not use. So responsibility is now with the individual as to how they use cannabis. Now it should be present for a person to be responsible. Awareness, proper awareness of the population, what they may want to, what they may expect. 20 years ago was considered one glass of wine is good. Have a glass of Kagor and it will prevent development of cardiovascular illnesses. But in the recent years, in 2016 in Europe, there was a major research. That last year in China, there was a major research with a sample of 500,000 of people that showed that even small doses of alcohol are harmful. Now about cannabis, the responsibility, well, all countries are different. There are different cultures, there are different mentalities. I think it should be individual for the country, whether the population is ready for that kind of responsibility, abusing or not, using or abusing. Because overdose that will lead to hashish-based psychosis is very heavy. Treating hashish psychosis is very hard. Not everyone will get out of that condition peacefully. Many of them may stay in chronic psychosis and will have to be observed by a psychiatrist. And it's very hard. So there's a need to understand the consequences of abuse should be with every individual.
Thank you. Let's move to perhaps the most controversial aspect of this briefly, and then open up for questions from the floor. So we've touched upon medical use. We very quickly touched upon incarceration, and while there may not be agreement on the panel, it's probably not the focus of your work is how much people should be put in prison or not. Should people have the freedom to use cannabis in their own home? Let's say adults, so we can take that out of, we're not talking about minors. It's part of the provocative question we're discussing today. Is there a circumstance, should laws change, where it's just okay, understanding that there are issues with the tobacco industry and the liquor industry and big tobacco, big liquor, and so on, putting aside the business aspect of it? How do you feel about just letting people smoke marijuana?
Your question is good, but I think we've shaped the discussion incorrectly. Burroughs mentioned that there are different types of cannabinoids. There's one called CBD that does not get you high, and you can take it in many forms. And the question whether you should use it in your home, of course you could use it in your home if it's CBD. Now, on the other hand, if it is THC, and you are taking a high dose of THC, whether it's smoking or in other forms, then yes, there may be some issues there, but we are bringing the two issues together without separating them. I'm also throwing in that there are other components of the cannabis that may be of beneficial use. So your question whether you could use it in your home or not, I suppose that for the recreational use and so forth, yes, in a private home, somebody should be allowed to do that. But certainly you should not take it out in public and so forth. They say, Vincent, we've passed laws that you cannot use it in public, but you're allowed to have a small quantity on top of you and use it in your own home. But I still want to separate that when it comes to CBD, and for a country like Kazakhstan, if you were ever to get into this, maybe that was an important start. Looking at CBD, which can be used generally for its medicinal purposes, and I don't know if that touches your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you. Will?
I think people using in their home, no one should go to jail or get an arrest record because they're using, an adult is using a substance in their home responsibly, right? Obviously, if you give it to a minor or something like that, that's a different question. But if it's just an adult that has some in their home, government resources should not be expended towards trying to incarcerate or arrest the individual for using in their home. And I think there's probably general agreement on this panel on that. Where, again, our organization would push back, though, is we want to see the least amount of people using in the home as possible. And so when we're talking about the commercial industry, that's why we oppose the commercial industry, because moving forward in marijuana policy, while in the past, we have seen this idea of incarceration, which is why the question came up, incarceration, arrest records, and punitive policies for marijuana use. We should move forward from that, but the moving forward from that should be to allow the people to have not be prosecuted in their own homes if they have or use, but not to allow big tobacco and big alcohol and these other industries to market their product in our nations. We know the track record of these companies, and I can't stress enough that we cannot allow them to have a new product that they will place in people's homes.
So I just look at that really as, again, a regulatory issue that the governments can address with policy. So if advertising and using predatory techniques to try and convert customers is being used, then that's an issue that policy can address. And it has been in the way in which Canada has rolled out the industry. So I think some of the issues that are occurring in the US happen largely because they were the first jurisdictions to open up the sale of the product in a recreational way. And there is obviously some issues with how much freedom they gave corporations to try and market product generally to the public. If governments choose policy that restrict corporations' abilities to use predatory techniques, then that's far less likely. And really, adult use in the home is really about educating the person on what a safe use of the product actually is. So I'm aghast that a store would sell to someone to a woman who's pregnant. That is absolutely stunning to me that's occurring even once. Never mind that that's the norm. That certainly would not be representative of the experience that we have in our retail stores in my country.
So I'm about to open it up to the public here. Quickly, general agreement, if well regulated, if kept out of the hands of predators, possibly home use, decriminalizing, again, bearing in mind, I mean, because the reason I'm trying to get to this is there a fundamental issue any of you experts has with the use of marijuana at all? Or is it how it's marketed, how it's done, how it's regulated, how it's dosed, and so on? Because that is a key issue, because there are people out there who feel that it's just bad, it's morally bad, nobody should ever use it, and so on. But it sounds as though on this panel, there is a sense that depending on the levels of restriction you'd want to advocate in terms of sales and distribution and age and other factors, that there is some room somewhere out there for some form of non-medical use of marijuana by adults.
I would say not for non-medical use, no, we would be opposed to that. But there's a difference between saying that we should put someone in jail because they do that, right? Or give them an arrest record. We don't believe our nations should be promoting intoxication in any form, whether it's alcohol or marijuana. When we're talking about the medicinal point of it, as was already mentioned, CBD, for example, you're not going to get intoxicated or get high from that, but we do oppose the idea of promotion or even government condoning of more ways of intoxication. We should be seeking ways to see less intoxication in our countries. But again, that doesn't mean if you are someone that does that, that you should then go to jail. The person should receive appropriate help if necessary in that scenario.
Understood. I need to open up to the public. We have with us Bahit Tumenova from the public foundation Aman Sağlık, which means health and prosperity. And I wanted to welcome you. And what are your thoughts on this before we open it up to the audience?
It's a very important issue for Kazakhstan. This is a transit country through which a lot of narcotics are traveled. Also the country that has the famous Chu Valley where cannabis was born and where it grows. You know, in fight against narcotics, humanity never won. Columbus, in 1400 or 55 or 65, whatever it was, when he discovered America, he brought tobacco back. In 17th or 16th centuries in Russia and in the Ottoman Empire, death penalty was introduced for tobacco consumption. We did have that in humanity's history, and it's continuing throughout our history. And as Zhibek was mentioning, my attitude as the human rights activist is the right of choice is individual. Why? Humanity cannot win, so let individual be responsible. As one of the speakers saying, individuals, organisms have places that are responsible for sleeping, for mood. Well, if the world is not perfect, there are wars being waged, there's poverty, there's unemployment, there are major problems out there. Individual will look for ways to find calmness in this narcotics, and we can't do anything against that because the world is not perfect. If so, then we should never treat them as criminals for use, because it's not the guilt, it's the responsibility of the whole community. So when we speak about that, first of all, we should start with the individual. And I think the approach should be not of banning, but very early we should start talking honestly as to what is narcotics and what is cigarettes, tobacco, alcohol, cannabis, and other narcotics, and the choice should be with the individual. But if it already happened, we shouldn't treat individuals as criminals, we should treat them as patients. And today our organization that protects a right to health, we advocate for the conception of harm reduction, the concept of harm reduction. For addicted people, we have over 120,000 IV addicts. Then we should open up the way for those who want to use their right of choice, methadone replacement therapy. Those who smoke cigarettes today and have nicotine addiction, not use addiction, but help them use electronic cigarettes or replacement of regular cigarettes, IQOS and all sorts of like that. So it's a harm reduction concept. Maximize harm reduction. And second most important thing, I think, is the approach should be purely science-based, not because something happened. No, it has to be studied thoroughly. And thirdly, I would say, on top of the scientific approach, we should also remember the real situation in this country. Speaking of Kazakhstan, let's be honest. What is available and what are the problems we have here and how we should act in that regard? So, scientific approach and separating different aspects of cannabis. And we're talking of two directions. Medical part, medical use of cannabis for medical purposes. And second is consumption for recreational purposes. So I think the most important thing when we talk about this, as people and politicians, we should start at the individual level. And today, thank you, by the way, the forum for inviting. I just came back from Portugal, where I attended a conference of 1,200 people. We spoke about this concept of harm reduction. If we can't solve this problem, then as is, then we should take the perspective of harm reduction, and it has to be deeply science-based. And today, Kazakhstan has use its Chu Valley for benefit, but it has to be thoroughly and deeply studied with proper approaches. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a really great summary. So basically, science-based harm reduction, more education, and for people who already are addicted, there should be treatment. That's a great summary. Thank you. In the front.
I had the amazing experience in the last couple of years that I was very seriously sick. I was given so many different tablets that really was killing me and addictive and nervous and everything. Until a year ago, about 8 months ago in Los Angeles, they suggested CBD, that the gentleman, and they gave it to me. Believe me, within a week, the pain really went down so rapidly that I could live again. Because I thought that my life was finished with this CBD. And then when I really looked at it and talked to the people, even the cells in there, they find the direction themselves where you have inflammation in the body, and it goes right sit on the nerve and the body that has problem. So this is something that is very useful. But for the economy of Kazakhstan, this would be amazing, fantastic, because in truth, the marijuana is growing itself. You don't really have to invest that much in it. You can go and cut it and make it ready. And okay, of course, the medical industry will be very happy with you, because a lot of these dangerous tablets will get out of the system. But economically, socially, health-wise for the country, it would be fantastic.
So, thank you for that.
Anders,
So, a personal testimonial.
Anders,
I'm curious, any
if I
responses
may,
to that? We have somebody here for whom it
very
worked.
short remark, if I may. Thank you very much for this. You open a really important issue, and this is what we are talking all the time. Regulation is important for the Kazakhstan, for each country. If we regulate the medicine, everything could be better. We are not talking about legalization, we're talking about regulation in terms of medical use. Recreational use is something different. Sooner or later, at the end of the day, we're faced with the abuse. But this is a very good remedy on the hand. So allow us to keep the marijuana and extract in the hands of pharmacists and doctors.
So, any thoughts, any disagreement? I mean, we have a testimonial from someone for whom CBD worked. Any thoughts on?
And he told me that story last night. I was impressed. I practiced in New York, and I wrote a lot of prescription for opioid medications, a lot of prescriptions. And today, I'm sad to say, a lot of those patients, or many of them, are addicted because the drug reps told me that those prescription medications were safe, and they were not. They made people even more addicted to the medication. You hear in New Hampshire and the northern part of the United States, there's about 45 people who die every single day from prescription drug overdoses. And what we're finding is that by using CBD, which doesn't get you high, you can relieve the pain. And you had said there are only 3 conditions. The Crohn's disease, inflammatory bowel disease, arthritis, all kinds. There's a huge number of illnesses that can benefit.
Thank you.
So I want to...
Another question here in the front row.
Kirill Pavlov,
the Trade Union of Future Ham Producers.
Thank you for being here.
I have a question. I have 2 questions. One to Dr. Jerrol Thompson. 3 years ago, I started raising the issue of marijuana legalization, and multiple public figures supported me, the moderator, Rahima Shakbayev, and I have a tradition during any forum, economic investment, no matter what forum would be attending, would try to touch on that, at least a little bit. And now we can see that Eurasian Media Forum has a whole session devoted to that. I understand that the state has to go through certain bureaucracy procedures before authorizing our farmers to grow and produce cannabis for medical use. In your experience, how much time do we need in order for us to have hemp producing in agriculture so that it would be highly efficient and so that it would be export-oriented? And the second question to Zhibek, Zholdassova, as you are comparing marijuana to alcohol, based on your experience and your practice, how often do you see aggression on the part of a person affected by marijuana as compared to a person affected by alcohol? Thank you.
Quickly.
First of all, you have to start with public discussion, like it's been done now. And I really want to applaud you all for starting a process in Kurdistan. There are persons on the right, there are persons on the left, need to bring them together and come to the compromises. Let them learn what is really needed. Then there is the International Narcotic Control Board in Vienna. You have to start discussions with them to understand the process. And then you have to frame your legislation. And the process of framing legislation can be relatively short. There are others who've done this before. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but you have to tweak it for the Kurdistan situation. And then there are regulations. I do believe that, as has been raised, on one hand, you do have to have maybe some commercial aspect to this in order to make sure it is safe, it is done properly, and it is done according to good agricultural practices and good manufacturing practices to get the oil. Those things you do need, and there's some standards that you could put in place that you can adopt to make sure that this industry works. I believe in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we did it in under 1 year. You understand? But there was political will. There was political will, and we did the public consultations, and there were a lot of people who disagreed, but we convinced them. And I think that maybe in Kurdistan it might take a little longer, but you yourself may have to compromise, but at the same time press forward and speak to your leaders. I think that they seem to be willing, based on this discussion, to move the process forward in some degree.
Zhibek, he also posed the question to you.
Thank you for the question. Let's have a look. Hemp is a substance that affects the consciousness of a person, changing it, and therefore the control over behavior and emotion will be modified. Therefore, what kind of a state do we come to? As I mentioned, there are 3 stages. If the person goes through two first stages, then there probably won't be any aggression. However, most of the people using cannabis for fun use it until they reach the 3rd stage, hallucinations. And what kind of reactions that person will have, it depends on that very person. Under the effect of hallucinations, a person loses his or her control totally and can do whatever. Because if the voice tells that person, go jump off the 20th floor, he will go and do it. How often do you see cases like this? Regularly, because I get patients on the 3rd stage, those who take themselves to the stage of hallucinations, and they say themselves that, yes, after I've smoked, I can do whatever. If we stop the source of funding, the intended donations, I would say, towards rights protection organizations fighting for the healthy lifestyle, can we legalize it faster and use it for and use cannabis for all of those purposes?
So that's your question then. Anyone quickly want to answer? One person?
I'll say, I think the discussion, we've heard also testimony of the medicinal use of it. The gentleman here talked about that he wanted to start a farm for selling medicinally. But I think we just have to remember, and I think there is 100% agreement in this room that there's medicinal use and that intoxication does not have to follow if it's used medicinally. However, we should remember that knocking on the door when we're talking about medical use is recreational in huge industries that want to have people not using for medicine, but using for intoxication and to get high, and that's what the danger is. But if we're careful to separate those two things, then that would be a good way policy forward for all of our countries. I'm going to just, in good fun, I have utmost respect for the gentleman here, but with the wonderful hat that he has on, that's an example of what I'm talking about, the conflation of the issues. We don't usually see people walking around with other medicine hats, for example, whether we're talking about morphine or aspirin, right? So there's a recreational aspect that is celebrated as well as a medicinal component, and we have to be very careful when we're talking about the issue not to conflate those two, but if it's used medicinally, as the example of the gentleman here and the question that was asked and what you would like to do with the farm, then that's a good thing. If we allow that to be the entrance to commercialization, then that's a bad thing.
Thank you.
I'd like to also point out that bad actors aside, the worst actor in this industry, which we haven't really addressed, are the drug dealers themselves. And the fact that this product has been supplied to consumers that want it for decades by people that aren't just interested in selling cannabis. They want to sell things that are far more addictive than that. So cannabis has often been described as a gateway drug. It's not that cannabis makes you interested in taking other drugs, it's that the people that are selling that to you want to sell you something else as well. So if you're talking about responsible recreational use, I would choose a system that's regulated rather than one that's not. Because if you can control how patients, or not patients, but individuals have access to the product that they want to buy anyways, it's far better in the hands of a system that's being controlled. The quality of the product is being regulated itself. Governments determine that the product that's being sold doesn't have pesticides on it, doesn't have heavy metal exposures. None of that promise you'll get from drug dealers or where they source their product. So it's inappropriate to think that just because some large corporations would want to sell more effectively to customers, that's the worst scenario. The worst scenario is that billions of dollars are going into the hands of illegal industries that turn around and use it for nefarious purposes.
That's great.
If I may.
No, actually, sorry, we're almost at the end. We have one more question, and then you can wrap up, but we're really coming to the end, sadly.
Few years back, there was a young researcher in Britain, I think. He found out a shocking news. I mean, for me, it was a shocking. He said that the alcoholic drinks like brandy, whiskey, rum, vodka, which has high content of the alcohol, drinks are more dangerous than narcotics. Why the governments are struggling to ban these narcotics, but whereas the alcoholic drinks, which are more dangerous, are legally available. And today we are discussing about the legalizing or marijuana or not. But my question is to all the panelists, whether is there any alternative? If you are talking about, as if I came to the opinion that as if this marijuana is the only plant where it has medical purposes. We have millions of plants, millions of substances. Is there any alternative which we can get from marijuana can replace it? Thank you.
Anyone, quickly? Borut.
Well, yes, thank you. If I may, this is exactly what I would like to explain before. So forget about legalization. We're talking about regulation. And yes, there are thousands of medicinal plants that are very useful, and pharmaceutical industry already use them. So allow us to use this. So regulation is the first, and Kazakhstan is an excellent place. Angus, he's a pioneer in the growing. If you're going to follow all the requirements and guidelines in terms of good agricultural practice and good pharmaceutical practice, this is bingo. Bingo for the country. You could export a very good, what? Active pharmaceutical ingredient. For the moment, forget about legalization. Regulation is what is needed here for this country.
Thank you, Borut. So now you're going to have to help me with this. We have 1 minute, and I don't mean 1 minute each. So you basically each get 12 seconds to divide up to 60. So, promise me we can do this. Will.
So 12 seconds, with marijuana policy, we must stay between the extremes. One extreme is incarceration, criminal penalties, punitive policies for marijuana use. The other extreme is commercialization, big tobacco, big alcohol, and allowing these companies to have a new product in a new industry that already in the United States, they're ruthlessly marketing to young people to communities at disadvantage, and we can't allow that.
Thank you.
That's the other extreme.
Angus.
I think I support the idea that every nation needs to come to its own decisions on the kind of policy that's appropriate for the people in those countries, and that carefully regulated system is the safest one you can get.
Excellent. Zhibek.
Legalization of marijuana in broader terms for general use will probably bring down the legal load on for the Ministry of Justice, but it will bring up the burden for the medical institutions, for the healthcare system, because this is a connected vessel. This is connected vessels.
Excellent. Thank you. Borut.
Anders, skip me. I said enough.
Thank you. Jerrol.
Thanks for the extra 12 minutes. There are dozens of plants that we use for medical purposes. We've gotten plants out of the Amazon that we use for cancer and so forth. And it's ongoing. I believe that the old stigma in relation to cannabis is passé, it's gone. In terms of the ingredients, especially CBD, putting that into soft drinks, putting that into other things is not a problem. There may be a need for commercialization because I want it done properly.
Excellent way to finish. Thank you. Thank you so much. No, thank you. I promised 4 o'clock, and thank you for everybody for engaging. And if you want to talk to the panelists, come up afterwards. But thank you, everybody, for coming to this great way to end this amazing conference.
And please, a round of applause for Andres Ilves. His tough moderation there at the end.
You're right.
Well done, well done. I've never heard anyone given 12 seconds, so I'm so impressed. Gentlemen, thank you. And ladies, thank you very much. And please get comfortable again.